Hello, everyone. Thank you for the introduction. It took me a really long time to get all of those Pictionary clues, so I don't know what that says about what I'm about to present next, but I guess we'll see. So today I wanted to talk to you a little bit about, and I only have 10 minutes, so I'm going to go pretty fast. But it's meant to be a bit of a primer, and what I really want to talk to you today about is how we experience architecture and how we read buildings in our urban environment and in our cities, and how that relates to space. So I'm one of those people who I went to architecture school without really knowing what architecture was and what architecture meant and what architecture was capable of doing. And in my experience, and I would have fallen into this camp, I think a lot of people view architecture as being a very deeply technical profession, and it is. And things like structure, building systems, building science, they're all really important to architecture. They're all fundamental to creating safe spaces. But it actually is so much more than that. And I can't count the number of times I've had people come up to me and say, I would have gone into architecture, except, I'm not very good at math. And part of me just wants to say in response to that, well, almost nobody in my architecture school class was good at math. So here we are. Architecture is a deeply expressive medium, and it is fundamentally a medium that can be manipulated, and how architects use the tools of building to say something about their built environment, about their cities, about the way people live. To me, that's really what architecture is about, and that's what I'm going to talk to you about today. So take wood, for example. Everyone's familiar with wood. Everyone's seen a house being framed. So, everyone, I think, is familiar with how wood is used in architecture. But wood is also a deeply expressive material. And you can just take the fact that there's a sort of inordinate number of ways you can connect two pieces of wood, that you can join two pieces of wood together to create a structural connection for a different purpose, to kind of start to tell a story about how it gets used to create something that's very expressive and experiential. This is a museum project. The architect actually was inspired by a Japanese toy called Sidori. Some people might be familiar with it. I wasn't when I was looking at some of these projects, and I'm probably not even pronouncing it correctly. But basically, it's a toy that involves basically matchstick pieces of wood that are notched, so that when you put three of them together and twist the last one, it kind of locks everything into place and creates this three-dimensional joint. And you can keep doing that in an additive way. And the architect asked the fundamental question: is this something that can be scaled up and used to create a building? And obviously the answer was yes, and used it to create a very experiential space, a space that is very evocative of something that's important to Japanese culture, that being the use of wood in building, and how that sort of folds into all aspects of Japanese life, and to create these very emotive spaces in a museum. This I've always felt to be a very emotive project. This is a chapel in Arkansas, is clearly inspired by medieval European Gothic chapel architecture, but wood is used in a way to create something completely new. So using old forms and an old way of organizing space, wood is used to create a space that is all about light and is all about the experience of nature and its surroundings. So this is something you couldn't actually do with stone, of course, being the traditional medium of a Gothic cathedral, say. So turning that whole idea on its head. Here's a project that takes a completely different approach. So this is all about how the project reacts to its outside environment looking in, using a high degree of reflection and a high degree of transparency. This project, which is part of the Louvre in France, is not actually where the Louvre is, but it's part of the museum complex. But it reflects the park that it's in, and of course the high degree of transparency allows light to pass right through it. And so to make that work, it was really important to hide that structure and hide the structural tectonic as you can see, just by the way that the columns are buried into the ceiling, and everything just sort of dies into a plane. So, completely different approach to the project we just looked at, for a very different purpose and set of purposes. Here's a house in Japan that is using a heavier material, a more austere, weighty material. It's built into the earth, and where the concrete is fundamentally where the building is built into the earth. And this is all about contrast. So this is about taking a really heavy, beautiful, but austere and heavy and a little bit cold form, and juxtaposing it against these openings and a very curated experience around how light comes into the space and where light is sort of allowed into the space. And it's done in a very sort of serene and kind of, austere way, and very calculated. Everything about this project is very calculated. But then you take the work of an architect like Luis Barragan, a Mexican architect, who essentially uses the same material palette as the project we were just looking at, but uses it in a completely different way. So here's an architect that is obsessed with the light and color. So while the palette may be concrete and light and openings similar to the previous project, in this case, it's bright and it's cheerful in a sense, and colors used to accentuate light, to draw attention to openings, and to bring accentuate specific moments, such as the corner in the pool here. Barragan actually was very inspired by Mexican culture and Mexican vibrancy, and even the work of Mexican artists like Frida Kahlo, which you can sort of see echoed throughout his space. A room like this has similarities to the one we just looked at, but obviously feels completely different. Architects can also use structure and the tools of building to create things that seem like they shouldn't be possible. And of course, Apple does things like this all the time. This is, of course, the Steve Jobs Theater as part of the Apple campus. This space actually feels like it shouldn't work. And what it is it's a carbon fiber roof, so obviously it's very lightweight, and engineered in such a way that it takes advantage of some uplift as well, but it's just bearing on glass. It's supporting itself on a material that most people don't think of as being a material that can support a roof. And maybe in parts of the world where it snows a lot, like here, it can't. But it works here, and the glass is curved. And yes, on the one hand, that's because that's what Apple would do. But on the other hand, actually curving the glass helps prevent it from buckling and helps take advantage of that compressive strength. And these guys were so obsessed about that image and that feeling of the lobby that they took what was arguably the main thrust of the project, being the theater, which is a more rigid form, a dark space, a heavier space, something that was very at odds with what's going on at grade. And so they just buried it. Of course, it would have interfered with that feeling that they were trying to create above. Here's a project. I've just been obsessed with this project ever since I was in architecture school. But this is obviously it's a very long cantilever that appears to be supported on nothing more than a small, skinny little stair element here. And again, it doesn't feel like it should work. It feels like something that should very easily tip over. But the physics here are just physics, and birds understand this. So the reason it works is because it exists in balance and harmony. And the reason this bird doesn't tip over is because the bird exists in equilibrium. The back and the front are balanced, and it's able to transfer its weight to two fairly spindly little legs. So you can imagine if that bird was his legs were buried in the sand, and you start to have a better understanding of how this building stands up. And so if we take that building and then look at its structure, you see, well, it has a massive concrete raft that's underground that actually essentially mirrors the structure above, that resists all this tendency to want to rotate. but you're not aware of it on the surface because it's buried and you can't see it. But that structure basically works against the earth to solidify and essentially resist the rotational force that you would expect to find in a project like this or a building like this. You could take something like, the humble arch. Everybody, I think, is aware of the significance of arches and its structural performance. The Romans obviously knew this and were able to create monumental buildings with probably, I'm guessing, a fairly rudimentary understanding of the forces and the physics. Maybe that's not fair to the Romans, but they made it work probably through a lot of trial and error. But you can take a modern building that exploits the structural strength of an arch. And this was a building by Felix Candela, who is obsessed with these thin-shelled concrete structures. That again, it's a building that feels like it shouldn't necessarily work, and it's expressing the arch in a completely new way and a completely different way than what you might see in a sort of monumental classical building like this aqueduct. The concrete is extremely thin, and it works because it's exploiting the strength of the arch. And in fact, what Candela has done with this project, and this is a similar project, but it's essentially the same, is curved it in both directions. So it creates a shape called a hyperbolic parabola. You can look that up later, but it's essentially curved in multiple directions. In this case, it's curved this way, and it's curved the opposite direction this way. You can kind of get a better sense of it here. And so this is taking the idea of an arch, a very classical, very ancient way of building, and turning it on its head to create something completely new and a new kind of experience. And I'm just going to finish here, I think probably getting close to my 10 minutes. Finish here with a project from our own practice that looks at this, and in being a little bit more familiar with it and some of the practical necessities that we had to deal with. I can explain that a little bit as well. So this is a YMCA rec center in Calgary, and the idea here was to create a building that was very evocative and complementary to its landscape, which in this case is an urban edge condition kind of in the foothills of Alberta. And so the building tried to take advantage of that motif and create something that was very undulating like a hill. And I think the reaction that a lot of people had when they first saw this, when it was in concept and before it was built, was like, that looks really expensive. That looks like something that we wouldn't think of the city of Calgary as funding. That it's something that maybe is not being altogether responsible with taxpayer dollars or something of that nature. The kinds of comments you usually get. And in fact, that isn't the case at all. And we worked really hard to find ways to make a form like this economical. And the way we did it, ultimately, at the end of the day, I mean, we used a lot of physical modeling. We used a lot of sort of manual tools, but we also really exploited digital tools and digital modeling and building information modeling and actually ultimately parametric modeling, where we could actually design using a specific set of parameters to create a highly efficient form that relied on essentially one shape. So at the end of the day, it's this very undulating, very kind of almost random appearance, but it's all created from the same hockey stick shape here that you see at the bottom. And simply by cutting the wood structure to different lengths and using different lengths of wood, but bending it along the same curve. And if anybody has any understanding of how wood structures are manufactured, they use jigs and molds essentially to create the curves. And if you're doing a unique mold or unique jig for every structural member in the project, that's going to make for a very expensive building. And so using technology and using tools to create an urban form that was important to us and important to the story we were trying to tell, and then leveraging technology to make it cost effective. So that's just an example to end on from our own practice and give you a bit of a sense of how the marriage and the melding of the science of building and the experience of architecture and spaces in our built environment come together. I don't know how that was for time, but that brings me to the end, and I think a bit of a Q&A before we move into an activity.
Great, thanks so much, Tyson. Yeah, it was perfect timing. Yeah, I really loved your presentation, and Tyson and I actually worked very closely together at GEC. I didn't know that much about the YMCA project, so it's really interesting to learn how it was optimized, yeah, to save on costs. So yeah, I'm opening up the floor to anyone who has any questions for Tyson. Could be related to the presentation or more broadly about the field of architecture. So feel free to unmute, or you can also type in the chat.
Yeah, so I could start us off. So obviously you've shown some like really interesting building designs and really creative building designs. And I was wondering what your opinions are of the Royal Ontario Museum, because I've heard a lot of people say that it's really unique, but others say that it's like so unique that it's like not even functional. So yeah, I'd just love to hear your thoughts on yeah, how do you think about the design of that building?
Yeah, good question. I've thought a lot about that building actually. I can't speak very knowledgeably maybe about some of what the architect was going for with that form. I know he has a few projects that sort of follow a similar motif, and I think that project has always struck me as one that was, and this is an opinion more than anything else, because I think and it's one that's maybe not grounded in, again, a very deep knowledge of kind of what drove some of the moves, but obviously there was an attempt to create something that was in opposition to the classical kind of Baroque museum, the original museum building, and sort of insert this sort of wildly different postmodern form into it. My sense is that the form, and this is my opinion, but the form is very much about itself. Like it's a sculpture, in other words, right? It was, I think, an attempt to create something artful and expressive, and again, contradictory to what was already there, for the sake of thinking about architecture and sculpture. I do find, just from my own observations walking around the space, that you can sort of perhaps appreciate an argument for why it might not be all that functional. There are, some weird wedge-shaped spaces in there that don't seem to make a ton of sense. But I definitely see that one as being a little bit more about itself, a little bit self-referential, a little bit. I always hate to call architecture art, because I think it's kind of bounded by a lot of other things, that whereas true art, I don't know if it is. It's but it is a cultural artifact, and I think fundamentally I think of it as sculpture.
Thanks, Tyson. Just looking in the chat, we have some more questions from the rest of us here. Catherine is asking, is it expensive to use building techniques that are not common locally? And what do you look to as sources of inspiration typically?
Yeah, I think I mean, it's expensive to use building materials that aren't common locally. But more than that, I think it's environmentally, it's not as sustainable. I mean, I think these days there's a big push to get the most out of local materials and local resources, and materials that don't need to be, shipped huge different distances. Especially nowadays, I mean, the economics of building is a little bit out of whack these days, coming out of COVID and supply chain. And yeah, we have found in our own work that yeah, being careful not to specify products that need to come from far away actually is becoming more and more important. The techniques, and maybe that's, sorry, I was sort of talking about materials. I mean, I think techniques is a similar problem. I think the issue with building techniques is a lot around the fact that it's difficult to find trades and construction folks who actually are familiar with them here. And so you often have to import the talent as well, depending on what you're trying to do. And for me, I'm very inspired by cities. I mean, a lot of my own work is very urban focused, urban design. I do a lot of work in transit. And I actually just spend a lot of time just watching people and watching how people use urban space and public space. I see the next question here. What piece of advice would you give a high school student who's interested in becoming an architect? I think it's just important to observe, and I think part of what I was trying to get at with this presentation, and I think come up in the activity as well, is, you know, I'm hoping if you don't take anything else away from this, I think I would hope that you would take away a little bit more of a sense of how to look at buildings and how to look at the built environment and how to look at cities and how to think about how those spaces come together to create and enhance life and experience. And I would encourage anyone who's interested in architecture to just observe and watch the world around them. If you're comfortable sketching and you enjoy sketching, sketch it. And just build up a repertoire of ideas and things that inspire you.
Maybe I'll ask a question here, Tyson. Do you have a favorite material? Because I think you've shown like different materials and how they're being used in different buildings and environments. Do you have like a go-to that you're like, yeah, that's your favorite?
Actually, that's a good question. There's definitely materials that I go to or that I think about that are a little bit more, you know, maybe just new and novel, or, you know, I see them being used differently. You flip through architecture magazines. I've always been really drawn to natural materials. I don't know, that's going to be a bit of a cop-out answer to your question, but like I really love using wood in my projects. I really love you know, sort of juxtaposing natural materials like wood and even stone sometimes against materials like concrete and some of the more innovative, interesting metals that are out there. But I would say more than that. I kind of just it kind of depends on the project, and it kind of depends on the situation. Like I think, as I mentioned before, I do quite a bit of public transit work, and so you can imagine that the materials you use materials that you use have a big impact on how the space ages, we'll say, right? So take a TTC subway station. You can imagine if you decided that you were going to clad the whole thing in wood in the tunnel, you can sort of right down to ground level, you can imagine how that would start to look after not very long, based on the way people use it, right? And so you know, you get into, you know, projects like that demand a high degree of durability, and then I'm interested in finding new and unique ways of using materials and using new materials to create something beautiful but also durable, right? And that might be completely different to how I think about using materials on a house. So it's kind of maybe a non-answer to your question, but you know, I think the short version is it kind of depends. Is there any training outside of school that you feel helped? I was kind of for me, a bit of a weird case because I had really and you know, the piece that I led with I think is the truth. I really didn't know what I wanted to do when I came out of high school. I actually thought I wanted to be a doctor, so I went into science. I went into biology, which, you know, one might argue has more similarities to architecture than people would realize, but you know, reality is it's quite different. And I got maybe 3/4 of the way through biology when I kind of decided that maybe architecture was something that, you know, I kind of always knew but didn't really really appreciate that was something I wanted to do. And so I honestly, I just started taking art courses as electives. I started taking Roman architecture courses as electives. I did these while I was doing my biology degree. So, you know, that might be a little bit of a unique situation for me because I did this wildly different undergrad, but I did feel like just doing art or just doing things that are creative, making things, was really helpful. Helpful both to help with your creativity and to kind of hone in on things that inspire you, but also helpful just because, you know, you build up a repertoire of things that you can put in a portfolio, and you can start to, communicate a little bit about who you are. So anything that sort of helps you kind of build that, I think is useful.
So thank you for joining us for our first webinar, and have a good evening.